Hey everyone, welcome to Encounters USA. If it's aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, or dogmen you're looking for, you came to the right place. Now listen up as we listen to some of the latest encounters. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Encounters USA. I am your host, author Matthew Hines, and today we have an amazing show. We are going to do the second edition to our Maury Island Encounter series, which is the first actual UFO contact ever recorded, and why it's not listed as such is just another mystery that we're going to be looking at today. Now, if you haven't seen the first podcast where we talked about the Maury Island encounter itself, and we laid out the characters and we laid out the chronology, so that it would be as simple as possible, because it is such a complicated affair, and it involves not only Maury Island but these characters. Also, some of them show up later in the JFK assassination, and some of them show up dead. So it's not easy to keep track of all these events, and so that is one of the reasons we had one podcast where we just explained what was going on. And then our original intent was, as I said in the first podcast, to do the second podcast on location at Maury Island near Tacoma, Washington. Problem, the weather is just not really cooperating with this, and I'm not so sure that should I go there and go through the putting my boat in the water and all that. If in fact we're going to get the kind of weather that we're going to need, it's been really windy and rainy every day that I've wanted to do this, except for the one day last weekend when I did go out on my boat, but I didn't go to Tacoma. So if you are watching on YouTube, you can check this out for a few seconds, because that's what it would have looked like, at least in a few shots, had I actually made it to Maury Island. But don't lose hope. I will be going to Maury Island. The only problem is that we have had a few new developments. I've been doing stories on Olympic National Park, Bigfoot, and I did interviews with Rich Germeau, who had Bigfoot encounters. And then I've been talking to people involved in this DNA Bigfoot project, and it turned out to be such a fiasco that I just said it can't not be covered. So that is another thing that in the middle of trying to complete this segment, I'm also preparing for this next segment. And I've been talking to Dr. Melba Ketchum, and she's been willing to give me some answers to some of the questions that I have as to what went down when they released their findings. It's incredible. It's incredibly sad. It's an incredibly sad note on deceptions that are just intrinsic to our government. And it's also a sad story about how one woman in a field that's dominated by men came forward with pioneering breakthroughs, and because she wasn't the university researcher or whoever else, and these people had also, I'll just add, submitted their own DNA samples that all came back like bear or whatever. So they came back with nothing. And when she came back with something, she was literally, well, not literally, but she was crucified. I mean, professionally, personally. And so it's an amazing story, but one that we'll have to tell on the next podcast after this, if we don't make it down to do our Maury Island shoot in the next few days, because I really want to get this other stuff going, because just like this Maury Island business, this is going to take a little while to get through all the facts and the details, because there's so much involved and so many people involved over a long period of time. All right. So just so you don't miss any of this excitement that just is happening every week on Encounters USA, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell. And if you don't know what this podcast is about, we do aliens, we do Bigfoot, and we do Dogman. So you really don't want to miss any of the encounters. And I'm telling you guys, we're starting to make connections with people that are doing research in the field and writing books. And so one thing that was really fascinating was actually getting to meet Dr. Melba Ketchum, who was so famous from the UFO DNA study. So that is all coming up, and I don't want to leave you hanging, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. So we're going to switch over to our topic of today, which is a continuation of the topic from last week, and that is this Maury Island JFK connection. Now, as I said, in the last time that we talked, we laid out the players and we laid out the chronological order. But what we didn't do is we didn't have time to ask questions, nor did we have time to get answers. So the first thing that I want to do before we go any farther is I want to give you guys kind of a recap of what happened at Maury Island on June 21st of 1947. And if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you going back and watching the first video. But if you... I lost my thing. If you haven't seen it yet, yes, go back and watch the first video, and I will leave a link for you. I think it's going to end up showing up here. So I am going to. I lost my Maury Island thing. And I have to look it up now. And so, yep, I really am not happy about this at all because I lost my page. I hit the wrong button. So I just have to hit Google real fast and look for Maury Island incident. And I'm looking, if you guys want to read along with this, I'm looking in Weird US. And it is the Maury Island incident. So this is just, this is one site. There was another site that had a really good summary of this. And instead of me going through like I did last time and trying to put all this stuff through together in a uncomplicated way, today I don't have time to do that because I did it in the last podcast anyway, and I really broke it down for you. But so this is just going to be kind of a review. So as you listen, why don't we put on some music and turn down the lights a little bit if you are watching on YouTube, and relax and listen to the story. The Maury Island Incident. The 1947 Maury Island Incident is one of the lesser-known Washington State UFO occurrences, but it should be better known for several reasons. It is probably the first incident where a witness claimed that a man in black intimidated him into silence, and it took place before the famed Roswell crash. Yet there were many similarities between the two. Moreover, the two military intelligence officers investigating the sighting died in a tragic air crash before they could complete their investigation. Unfortunately, the two principal witnesses, Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman, became objects of suspicion and controversy as the investigation continued. In 1947, a common hazard in the waters of Puget Sound was the logs that floated on its surface. They escaped from the jams, waiting to be turned into lumber at nearby mills on the shore. Several men worked as an informal harbor patrol, snagging these logs and taking them to the mills for a salvage fee. Harold Dahl worked on one of these boats, and his supervisor on shore was Fred Chrisman. Dahl reported that on June 21st, he was on his patrol boat with two men, his son, and their dog. Around 2 p.m, Dahl's boat approached the east shore of Maury Island. Maury Island is now attached to Vashon Island by a causeway road and is about 6 miles west of Des Moines, Washington. Dahl looked in the sky and saw 6 objects floating about 2,000 feet above his ship. The objects were made of some reflective material, donut-shaped, and about 100 feet in diameter. The center holes were about 25 feet in diameter. Dahl said he saw round portholes and what he thought was an observation window. 5 of the craft circled over the 6th, which dropped slowly. It stopped and hovered about 500 feet above the water. Dahl put to shore because he was afraid the center aircraft was going to crash into his boat. Once ashore, Dahl took several pictures with his camera. The lower ship stayed in position for about 5 minutes, with the others still circling above. One of the ships left the formation and moved down, touching the lower ships. The two kept contact for several minutes until Dahl said he heard a thud. Suddenly, thousands of pieces of what he thought were newspapers dropped from the inside of the center ship. Most of the debris landed in the bay, though some hit the beach. Dahl recovered a few pieces, finding it was a white, lightweight metal. Along with the white metal, the ship dropped about 20 tons of a dark metal, which he said looked like lava rock. When the lava rock hit the water, it was so hot that steam erupted. They took cover after several pieces landed on his boat, damaging it. Some debris hit his son on the arm, burning him, and another piece killed his dog. After the rain of metal, the craft rose into the air and headed west out to sea together. Dahl went to his boat and tried to radio for help, but it did not work. They sailed back toward their dock, dropping the dog over the side as a burial at sea. Pretty rough. Dahl took his son to the hospital for treatment and then told his boss, Fred Chrisman, what had happened. Dahl gave Chrisman the camera, and when the prints were developed, they showed the strange airships. However, the negatives had spots on them, which he compared to film damaged by exposure to radiation. Chrisman said he did not believe Dahl's story, but nevertheless, he went back to Maury Island, where he gathered some rock samples. He said that while he was gathering the rocks, one of the airships appeared overhead, as if it was watching him. Dahl told investigators that the next morning, a man wearing a black suit visited him and suggested they go to breakfast together. Dahl drove his own car, following the stranger's new black Buick to a restaurant. While they ate, the stranger asked no questions. Instead, he gave a detailed account of what had happened to Dahl the day before. The man in black warned Dahl that bad things would happen to Dahl and his family if he told anyone about the incident. Dahl and Chrisman sent a package to publisher Ray Palmer in Chicago. A year or two later, Palmer founded Fate magazine. The package contained a box of metal fragments and statements about the strange happenings on the 21st and the 22nd of July. A few weeks later, Palmer contacted Kenneth Arnold, see Flying Saucers at Mount Rainier, who had begun investigating UFOs. Arnold arrived in Tacoma in late July with airline pilot E.J. Smith. The two of them met with Dahl and Chrisman, examined Dahl's boat, and conducted interviews. Dahl and Chrisman did not produce the pictures, however. Dahl also told Arnold that his son had disappeared. Dahl said later that his son was found waiting tables in Montana, but he could not remember how he got there. On the afternoon of July 31st, Captain Lee Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank Brown of the U.S. Army Air Force flew to Tacoma from Hamilton Field, California. In addition to being pilots, the two men were intelligence specialists. They met with Arnold, Smith, and Chrisman for several hours. One of the officers said he thought there might have been something to the story, but they had to leave around midnight. They were in a hurry to be at Hamilton Field on August 1st, the day when the Air Force was to split from the Army. The two officers flew out of McCord Airfield around 2 o'clock in the morning on a B-25 bomber with a crew of two other men. About 20 minutes later, the airplane crashed near Centralia, Washington. The two enlisted men managed to parachute to safety, but Davidson and Brown were killed, making them the Air Force's first casualties. Dahl and Chrisman said that the Air Force officers took some of the strange metal on board. People thought they heard anti-aircraft guns shoot the plane down. The local newspapers and FBI received phone calls stating that the plane was shot down to cover up the information Brown and Davidson had found. Because of the loss of life, the Air Force broadened its investigation, and the FBI launched their own. The Air Force investigators determined that the crash had been a terrible accident. One of the engines caught fire, and the men began bailing out. Before Brown and Davidson could jump, a wing broke and struck the tail section, which also broke off. The plane went into a spin, trapping the men inside. Now, my friends, we're going to turn up the lights, and we're going to look back into this story a little bit closer. Now, the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is this strange character, Fred Chrisman. His job as this drama begins to unfold is he is Harold Dahl's supervisor in this project of cleaning up logs. Now, is this the only thing that Fred Chrisman does? Well, no. If you listen to researcher Ken Thomas, who is the author of the book JFK and UFOs, well, Dahl and Chrisman have kind of a strange connection that I'll talk about in a second. But Chrisman, as I mentioned in the first podcast, is a World War II veteran, supposedly a pilot who came back after the war and somehow started getting involved in UFO stories, writing into Kenneth Palmer's magazine. And I hope I got that name right. Anyway, so Chrisman already has this amazing, he knows what UFOs are. He says he's actually been attacked by one, had a laser puncture his arm before lasers were even invented. So Chrisman is this very strange character. And when the encounter happens, as we hear in the story, the first thing, and it really depends on, this story has been told and retold so many times, but the thing that we have to look is cut through is, it's because some people say, oh, well, Dahl didn't believe him and he thought that he was drunk, whatever. Well, that's a minor detail of the story. What is a major detail of the story is not Dahl, but Chrisman went out because, according to the thing that we just read, Harold Dahl took pictures of this of these craft. Now, if you are not familiar with the way things used to work with photographs, you didn't get them. They didn't have today they're instant, but like in the 80s, they had, I think, 1 hour photo. Before that, you had to wait a few days. I think they sent your photos into some chemical lab or something. They were done, and then they sent back to the store. And so it took a few days to get your photos. So for Chrisman, or for Harold Dahl to come back with photos and show them to Chrisman, immediately that just would not have been possible or feasible. Chrisman would not have seen any photos for a few days. But he did find the story credible enough to go out the very next day. And according to the story, he was starting to pick up this slag or whatever it is off of the beach. Now, while he's doing so, according to this story, he is also chased by a UFO. So this makes it I just want people to be clear on this. The date is June 21st and June 22nd. So the Kenneth Arnold sightings are not going to happen for 2 more days. So this is the really first UFO sighting ever, and why it's not classified as the first UFO sighting ever, we'll talk about after we go through all of this intrigue and conspiracy and all this other stuff. But it is not considered the first UFO sighting, even though there was reported evidence. 2 people ended up dead from it, and mysterious things happened to people involved in it, and the Men in Black showed up. So all these things happened to something that ended up being a non-UFO experience, okay? Or a non-UFO, I guess we'll say it is an experience, but rather we'd say it's an encounter. All right, so the next thing that we want to talk about, and remember, I can't say this enough, that I am getting my information from, as I said, I read this excerpt from, it's called Weird US, and I just want to make sure, and I'll have a link in the description. It's called Weird US and Weird Washington. That's where I got the story from. Also, I am relying on some presentations by Ken Thomas, author of JFK and UFOs, and I'm also relying on some information for the airplane crash and the results of that from the UFO Hunters on the History Channel with Dr. Bill Burns. All right, so we're looking at the particular characters, and Dahl sees this UFO the next day, and he thinks it's watching him or whatever, and he runs away. So after this, then we have a series of events, and it's very hard, as you heard when I read the first in the first part of this podcast. It's very hard to keep track of the different people and places. So that's why I did one special podcast about it. Now, the next character that comes into play in this is none other than Mr. Kenneth Arnold. Now, what is Mr. Kenneth Arnold doing being associated with Dahl and Chrisman? Well, remember now the date is June 21st and June 22nd. He is not going to have his encounter until June 24th. So he's not even seen any UFOs yet, right? So, okay. So now we really need to start talking about the particular events and the particular people that we're going to see here. Now, Kenneth Arnold, he shows into the picture. We've got Dahl and Chrisman, and then Kenneth Arnold, he shows up in the picture. Now, why did he show up in the picture? Because Dahl and Chrisman sent them supposedly some of this material from the sighting. So this Palmer, this magazine publisher, he knows that Kenneth Arnold, according to the story, is interested in UFOs. Now, Kenneth Arnold at the time is selling firefighting equipment, but he is also actively searching for a crashed marine transport that went down at Mount Rainier and killed 32 Marines, and there's a $5,000 reward for it. So that is how Kenneth Arnold even gets into this picture, looking for UFOs and all that. So if you had watched my first podcast, then it's very difficult to do the time because nobody really emphasizes the time that elapses here. So you have to physically go through and say, well, how long does this last? And so in the second podcast, we're able to more accurately talk about, well, there's a longer transition of time here. And a lot of these things don't happen until the month of July. Now, in the first podcast, I made it clear that this encounter was June 21st and 22nd. Kenneth Arnold sees his UFOs on June 24th. The Roswell crash happens the first or second week of July. So while Roswell hasn't even happened yet, there's all of these things happening behind the scenes, and it's very about UFOs, and it's very hard to get people to understand how much is actually happening. Now, you've got Kenneth Arnold, who's been contacted by Palmer to go investigate this stuff, and Arnold also, I guess, contacts these Air Force officers, right? Now, let's talk about these Air Force officers for a second. These guys are counterintelligence, or I think in the summary I just read, they were called intelligence officers. At the time, intelligence, counterintelligence, what are they going to really make a distinction? It's just easier to print intelligence officers. So intelligence officers are people that may or may not exist. They go spy on people with other identities. So they may or may not exist. So they have two people who show up and they look at the stuff and they tell them that there might be something to their story. There might be something to it. They're interested in it. And we only have Chrisman and Dahl's word that they took any of the stuff with them. All right. So now these two officers, they've got to get back to Holman in California, Holman Air Force Base from McCord, because the Air Force is going to be not the Army Air Force anymore. Tomorrow they're going to be the the U.S. Air Force, and I don't know why it would be so important for them to be in California rather than Washington State. They're intelligence officers. It's not like they've got to play at play in the band or something. So, but for some reason, they take this stuff, according to Dahl and Chrisman. They take this material, some of it, and they put it on the plane. And they get on the plane with two other people. Now, when these two other people get on the plane, we don't really have any identity of who they are, other than that they are enlisted men and that one of them might or might not be associated, and one of them is definitely a hitchhiker, right? So we don't really even know who this person is. We don't know who Brown and Davidson are. Brown and Davidson, such generic, common names. We don't really know who they are. But 20 minutes after the airplane leaves from Tacoma at McChord Air Force Base, it crashes in Centralia. Now, according to the story we just read, people said they thought that the plane was shot down out of the sky. According to the story, and only Chrisman and Dahl say this, that they gave them material to put on the plane. Now, what happened during the crash is that Davidson and Brown supposedly died, and the two enlisted men were able to get out, and then they had the details of the crash and the wing taking out the back tail section in flames and all that. So now we have to really look at this, because if we just gloss it over and say, okay, so they had a plane crash, happens all the time. Well, it really doesn't happen all the time, and they're really under very suspicious circumstances that they are intelligence officers. They do have to fly a plane back to California in the middle of the night. It seems like they're almost there on a lark. And if it wasn't just for that, then there's the other things that start to get involved. And the other thing that starts to get involved is that now Chrisman has contacted the FBI. And so suddenly this mysterious spook, Guy Bannister, who also ends up working in FBI counterintelligence in New Orleans during the JFK assassination, suddenly Guy Bannister shows up and he's involved in the scene. And as I talked about in the first podcast, he had also collected UFO remains or supposed UFO remains. And so all of these people, before Roswell even happened, had all had this strange experience with these UFOs, and now two people are dead. So we just have to, this wouldn't really be a conspiracy show if we just let it go at that, would it? We really have to we've looked at the fact that Brown and Davidson might not even be Brown and Davidson. And then what about the story of these people jumping out of the airplane? They jumped out of an airplane in the middle of the night, and you have two enlisted men saying that they got out, but the pilots didn't. Now, I'm not sure about the B-25, but I know the B-17, they have a trap door and escape door under the pilot's seat. And so could they have gotten out that way? Did they die, or did they even exist to begin with? And Ken Thomas, in one of his lectures, showed a picture of Davidson's military issue ID card. And why would that, remember the passport of the hitchhiker from 9/11? Well, all this stuff burned up. They didn't find any of this metal slag that came off a UFO. They didn't find hardly anything, but they found this guy's plastic-coated paper ID. Okay, sure. But they didn't find anything else. They certainly didn't find Brown and Davidson. And so if they were just two faked identities, they could have just melted back in to the mainstream society and nobody would know any better. So there we have the plane crash, and there we have our first connection to Mr. Guy Bannister. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about, as far as this Maury Island encounter, is the fact that the aftermath of what happened. Now, after, as we talked about before, Dahl, who had his encounter with the men in black, who had told him, don't talk about this, he lost his son. His son ended up out in Montana. And it doesn't say that in this story, but his wife also got very sick, and he lost his job getting these logs out of the bay. So for Mr. Harold Dahl, things did not go so well after he saw the UFO and did not heed the advice of the men in black. Now, what else happened? What about Mr. Fred Chrisman? Well, Mr. Fred Chrisman, according to this story and the research done by Kenneth Arnold, Chrisman and Dahl had a relationship because Chrisman, and this is really where it gets weird, because Chrisman is involved in this kind of S&M gay scene that you see when you watch the JFK assassination, and you see that David Ferry and the Civil Air Patrol and them recruiting all these and hanging out with all these young boys and whatever. So Ken Thomas seems to think that Chrisman and Dahl have an association through this. Now, Dahl being married and having a son doesn't really fit into that profile. But Chrisman, he is so strange. According to Ken Thomas, he's a teacher in Tacoma. He ends up, after the UFO encounter, he ends up working at Hanford. And I'm not sure what he does at Hanford. And then later on, he's accused by Garrison, the district attorney for New Orleans, of being the shooter on the grassy knoll. So Chrisman just goes from one thing to another, and it all seems to revolve around this Maury Island thing. Now, we have to look at Chrisman and Bannister a little bit more closely because they both showed up at the JFK assassination. Now, Chrisman, what did he gave? As I said, there's many versions of this story. In one version of the story, Chrisman gave this box of cornflakes or whatever to Brown and Davidson to fly back with them. And so could there have been something in that box? Could the strange crew, the passengers, the almost stowaways that got on that plane, could they have had something to do with this explosion and the crash of the plane? Now, does that sound really like all of paranoia and whatever? Well, you have to stop for a second and think about who and what we are dealing with. As I said in the first podcast, and as we're talking about here, the Air Force is no longer going to be a part of the Army. And if you don't know anything about intergovernmental rivalries, the last thing any government entity wants to do is give its exclusivity of domain and right to bill for what they do and collect money from the government. The last thing they're going to do is give up that domain. They're going to want to be responsible for as much and know as much and be able to keep as much from other governmental bodies and agencies as possible, because that's just how it works. Now, What you have here is you have the Air Force. You have which is no longer the Army, but it's actually going to be the Air Force. So you have two different agencies right there, two different governmental bodies that are going to be competing with each other, and both of whom would want this technology. You also, so Brown and Davidson are both supposedly Air Force. Or are they? Are they Army intelligence? We don't know. But think about this before we go on. Army wants that stuff. Army wants to have this material, and they're going to get it. Air Force wants this stuff. Air Force is going to get this material no matter what it takes to get it. They put a guy on a plane. They sabotage the plane. They do something, but somebody gets off that plane and has that material, if the material is on the plane. All right? So that is one scenario of the Air Force Army rivalry. But then you also have J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, remember, by the time that these guys get on this plane, it is late July. Roswell has already happened. They've already locked up this material. J. Edgar Hoover is fuming. He is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Remember what I said? If you are an agency or a governmental body and you don't have jurisdiction over a thing and somebody else does, they bill for it. They collect money from the government for it in order to enforce or control or whatever it is they do over that entity. So for the FBI, for J. Edgar Hoover, who has to have his thumb up everything in the United States, for him not to have access to this material that ended up in Roswell and then ended up at Wright-Patterson, with him not having any access whatsoever, then I think you might have at least, more so than the Air Force Army rivalry, that FBI rivalry where we will do anything and sacrifice anything in order to be preeminent. And we still see that today with this organization, that they don't seem to have a lot of morals. It seems to be their own survival is the only thing that's good for them. So that being said, I'm going to ask you as the listener, is it completely plausible that Guy Bannister and J. Edgar Hoover said, whatever is in that, we're not going to give this up. We didn't get that stuff at Roswell, but we're going to get this stuff here. So did they sabotage the plane? Did they slip a Mickey to these Air Force officers? Did they, somebody working for the FBI, did they do something to an engine? Did they, pull a fuel line? Who knows? But all of these things are very logical. And as we, at the time, if you were to say this stuff, people would say, well, you're off your rocker. But, today, the way we have found that the government works or doesn't work, all of this stuff is completely plausible and, it's completely realistic. Of course, it is, of course, unsubstantiated, and there is no evidence whatsoever to support it. But then you also can look at the JFK assassination and say, look at the people you still have trying to push this lying narrative on us, and then you see what's really going on here. So that seems to be the issue with the questions of what happened after the Maury Island incident. Now, before you go, my friends, I want to finish up our little story that we began reading at the start. And for a little bit longer, we're going to turn down the lights just a little bit, and we're going to finish our story. Another Air Force investigator spoke with Dahl and Chrisman and visited their boat. He stated that the damage he saw did not match the damage the two sailors described. There were no piles of metal on Maury Island, and the existing samples looked like slag from a metal smelter. His conclusion matched that of the FBI investigator, that Dahl and Chrisman had faked the incident to gain publicity for a magazine article. The FBI warned Dahl and Chrisman that their hoax had not succeeded, and that if they dropped the matter, the government would not prosecute the two men for the fraud which had resulted in the deaths of the two officers. At first, Dahl and Chrisman went along. They made statements that the story was a fake and simply refused to give interviews on the matter. But a few years later, in the January 1950 issue of Fate magazine, Chrisman stated that the incident had happened, and Kenneth Arnold included Maury Island in his 1952 book, The Coming of the Saucers. Today, most people believe that Chrisman and Dahl faked the incident, perpetuating a hoax that got out of control. Other people believe that the U.S. government was behind a conspiracy that may have involved anything from UFOs to dumping nuclear waste in Puget Sound. They believe a shadow government agency sabotaged the B-25 bomber in order to eliminate the investigators and blame Dahl and Chrisman. Some investigators recently visited the crash site, hoping to find some of the strange rocks to prove things one way or another. But so far, no answers have been found. And that story is in Weird, Washington. All right, my friends. Well, there you have it. The Maury Island incident. And I just have to guarantee you that we will be going on location at a time in the future. But as I said at the beginning, I really would like to get on this story about the Bigfoot DNA fiasco out, because a lot of people are kind of waiting for that. So I might do the Maury Island on location podcast next week. And I'm also trying to get a fine gentleman. Is it Mike? Oh, I have to get on my Facebook to find him. But yes, I'm going to have a really nice guy on here, and hopefully we'll be able to have a nice guest on here instead of just having to listen to me. So, all right. It's really, I mean, this Maury Island thing, I'd really like to know what you think. So leave comments in the description, but think about it. An entire UFO encounter, an entire UFO, there's evidence left behind. People died from it. The FBI is involved. Two military agencies are involved. And then it ends up being a non-incident. It ends up, they say that it is a hoax, but and they're threatened with being prosecuted, but later they all come out and say that no, that it actually happened and made money from it. So what do you think? I think it's a really strange incident, and I think it's just another way that the government just covers these kinds of things up that are really pretty much just inconvenient truths for themselves. Well, friends, I must say that this has really been one of the most interesting podcasts I've done so far, and I'm really looking forward to doing the next one, which I'm going to get started on right now, and we'll have it out as soon as possible. So please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll get that notification when you get a new video. We're getting a lot of subscribers now, and I really want to thank you guys for signing on. We've got a lot of great stuff coming, and every week we find out some new things, and it's really awesome. So, for Encounters USA, if you're out there this summer, especially if you're down by Tacoma near Maury Island, please watch your back. Thanks for listening to tonight's show. Please remember, if you've had an encounter, we want to hear about it. Go ahead and email us at encountersusa1@gmail.com or contact us at encountersusa.com, our website, and go to the contact form. All right, everybody. Until next time, be careful out there. And if you're out in the woods, watch your back.